Sarah Martinez walked through the bustling corridors of Lincoln High School with her worn leather backpack slung over her shoulder. The 17-year-old had always been quiet, preferring to blend into the background rather than draw attention to herself. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her clothes were clean but clearly not expensive. She had learned long ago that keeping a low profile was the safest way to navigate the complex social hierarchy of high school. The morning had started like any other. Sarah had woken up in the small apartment she shared with her grandmother, Maria, who had raised her since she was 8 years old. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was young, leaving her with only fragments of memories and a few precious belongings that her grandmother had carefully preserved. Maria worked 2 jobs to support them both, cleaning offices at night and working at a local diner during the day. Despite their financial struggles, Maria had always emphasized the importance of education and treating others with kindness and respect. As Sarah made her way to her first period chemistry class, she noticed a group of students gathered near the lockers. The group consisted of some of the most popular kids in school, led by Madison Clark, whose father owned several successful businesses in town. Madison was everything Sarah was not: blonde, wealthy, confident, and seemingly untouchable. She wore designer clothes and drove a new car that cost more than Sarah's grandmother made in 2 years. Sarah tried to walk past the group unnoticed, but Madison's voice called out to her. "Hey, Sarah. Come here for a second." There was something in Madison's tone that made Sarah's stomach clench with anxiety. She had learned to recognize that particular inflection; it usually meant trouble was coming. Reluctantly, Sarah approached the group. Madison smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "We were just talking about the chemistry project that's due next week. You're really good at science, right?" Madison's friends giggled behind her, and Sarah could sense that this wasn't really about chemistry at all. "I guess so," Sarah replied cautiously, clutching her backpack straps tighter. She had always excelled academically, partly because she spent most of her free time studying rather than socializing. Books and homework were safe, they were predictable and fair in a way that people often weren't. "Well, we were wondering if you could help us out. You know, share some answers or maybe do a little extra work on our projects." Madison's request was phrased politely, but there was an underlying expectation that Sarah wouldn't dare refuse. Sarah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and anger. She had worked hard for her grades, staying up late by lamplight when the electricity bill was overdue, studying in the library when their apartment was too noisy. The idea of simply handing over her work to people who had every advantage in life felt deeply wrong. "I'm sorry, but I can't do that," Sarah said quietly but firmly. "It wouldn't be fair, and it's against school policy." The smile disappeared from Madison's face, replaced by a cold expression that Sarah had seen directed at other students who had fallen out of favor. "Excuse me?" Madison said, her voice rising slightly. "I don't think you understand. We're not asking for much. Just a little help between friends." "We're not friends," Sarah replied, immediately regretting the words as soon as they left her mouth. She saw Madison's eyes narrow and knew she had just made a serious mistake. The tension in the hallway was palpable. Other students had begun to notice the confrontation, some slowing their pace to watch what would happen next. Sarah felt trapped, surrounded by Madison's group with dozens of eyes on her. Her heart was pounding, and she could feel sweat forming on her palms despite the cool air conditioning. "You know what?" Madison said, stepping closer to Sarah. "I think you need an attitude adjustment. Girls, what do you think Sarah keeps in that ratty old backpack of hers?" Before Sarah could react, hands were grabbing at her backpack. She tried to hold on to it, but there were too many of them. Madison yanked the bag away from her and held it up triumphantly. "Let's see what secrets little Sarah is hiding," she announced loudly, drawing even more attention from passing students. Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. "Please give it back," she pleaded. "There's nothing interesting in there. Just books and homework." But Madison was already unzipping the bag, turning it upside down with theatrical flair. The contents spilled across the hallway floor with a series of thuds and clatters. Textbooks, notebooks, pens, and pencils scattered everywhere. Sarah's lunch, a simple sandwich wrapped in a paper bag, landed near someone's feet. A small bottle of generic shampoo that she kept for after gym class rolled under a locker. The watching students laughed and pointed, some pulling out their phones to record the humiliation. Sarah dropped to her knees, frantically trying to gather her belongings before they could be stepped on or kicked away. Tears of embarrassment and anger stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give Madison and her friends the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken. "Wow, Sarah," Madison said mockingly. "This is even more pathetic than I expected. Generic everything, and is that your lunch? A plain sandwich? How sad." Sarah continued collecting her things, her hands shaking slightly. Most of her possessions were indeed generic or worn. She and her grandmother shopped at discount stores and bought only what was necessary. But these items represented survival and perseverance, even if others couldn't see their value. As Sarah reached for her chemistry notebook, which had fallen near Madison's feet, something else caught the light. It was small and metallic, having rolled partially under a nearby locker. Sarah's eyes widened in recognition, and she quickly moved to retrieve it before anyone else noticed. But she wasn't fast enough. One of Madison's friends, Jessica, spotted the glinting object and picked it up before Sarah could reach it. "Hey, what's this?" Jessica called out, holding the item up for everyone to see. The hallway, which had been filled with laughter and cruel comments just moments before, suddenly fell silent. The small metal in Jessica's hand seemed to command attention in a way that none of them had expected. It was clearly military, with ribbons and colors that some of the older students might have recognized from history classes or movies about war. Sarah felt her blood run cold. She jumped to her feet, abandoning the rest of her scattered belongings. "Give that back," she said urgently. "Please, just give it back." But Jessica was already examining the metal more closely, turning it over in her hands. The inscription was partially visible, and, even from a distance, Sarah could see other students trying to read what it said. This was exactly what she had always feared would happen. The one thing she had tried so hard to keep private was now on display for everyone to see. Madison snatched the metal from Jessica's hands, holding it up to the light to get a better look. As she read the inscription, her expression changed from cruel amusement to confusion, then to something that might have been shock. The color drained from her face, and, for the first time since Sarah had known her, Madison appeared to be at a complete loss for words. "Where did you get this?" Madison asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The mocking tone was gone, replaced by something Sarah couldn't quite identify. Was it respect? Fear? Disbelief? Sarah stood frozen, surrounded by her scattered belongings and watched by dozens of her classmates. The secret she had guarded so carefully for years was now exposed, and she had no idea what would happen next. The metal that had once belonged to someone she had never met but had shaped her entire life was now in the hands of her tormentor, and the carefully constructed walls she had built around her past were crumbling down around her. The silence in the hallway stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of a bell signaling that first period was about to begin. But nobody moved. Everyone was transfixed by the small piece of metal in Madison's trembling hand and the girl who stood before them, no longer invisible, no longer just another quiet student trying to get through the day unnoticed. Sarah realized that everything was about to change, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what came next. The Medal of Honor gleamed in Madison's trembling hands, its distinctive blue ribbon with white stars seeming to catch every ray of fluorescent light in the school hallway. The bronze star at the center bore the head of Minerva, surrounded by the words United States of America in raised letters. This was not some replica or costume jewelry, this was the real thing, the highest military decoration that could be awarded to members of the United States Armed Forces. Sarah watched in horror as Madison turned the medal over, revealing the engraved inscription on the back. The words were clearly visible to anyone close enough to read them: Sergeant James Martinez, United States Army, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, Vietnam War, 1968. The silence that had fallen over the hallway was deafening. Students who moments before had been laughing and recording Sarah's humiliation now stood motionless, staring at the medal with a mixture of awe and confusion. Even the most historically ignorant among them understood the significance of what they were seeing. The Medal of Honor was legendary, something they had read about in history textbooks or seen in movies, but never encountered in real life. Madison's face had gone completely pale. Her usual confidence and superiority had evaporated, replaced by uncertainty and what looked like genuine fear. She held the medal as if it might explode in her hands, clearly wanting to put it down but not knowing how to gracefully extract herself from the situation she had created. "Sarah," Madison said, her voice cracking slightly. This can't be real. Where did you get this?" Sarah felt tears burning her eyes, but they were no longer tears of embarrassment. They were tears of grief, pride, anger, and a dozen other emotions that she had kept buried for years. She had never told anyone at school about her father, about his service, about how he had died. It was too painful, too complicated, and too sacred to share with people who might not understand. "It belonged to my father," Sarah said quietly, extending her hand palm up. "Please give it back." The crowd of students pressed closer, trying to get a better look at the medal and to hear what Sarah was saying. Word was spreading quickly through the hallway, with students who hadn't witnessed the original incident being drawn by the unusual sight of Madison Clark looking completely lost and a quiet girl they barely knew commanding the attention of the entire corridor. Jessica stepped forward, her curiosity overcoming her earlier cruel amusement. "Your father won the Medal of Honor? But you said your parents were dead. When did he die? How did he die?" Sarah felt cornered, surrounded by questions and stares from dozens of her classmates. This was exactly what she had always dreaded, having her private pain become public entertainment. But she also realized that there was no going back now. The truth was out, and she would have to find a way to deal with the consequences. "He died in a training accident when I was 8, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. 3 years after he came home from his 3rd deployment. He was teaching new soldiers how to defuse improvised explosive devices when something went wrong." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Sarah could see shock and dawning respect on faces that had previously shown only indifference or mild disdain. Even Madison's friends, who had participated in the backpack dumping with gleeful cruelty, now looked uncomfortable and ashamed. Madison was still holding the medal, but her grip had loosened considerably. "I don't understand," she said. "If your father was a war hero, why don't people know about it? Why don't you talk about it?" Sarah took a deep breath, gathering courage she didn't know she possessed. For years, she had kept her father's story locked away, partly out of grief and partly out of a desire to protect it from people who might not understand its significance. But now, with the medal exposed and dozens of eyes on her, she realized that maybe it was time to let people know who her father had been. "Because it's not a story people want to hear," Sarah replied. "People like the idea of heroes when they're in history books or movies. But when a hero's family is standing right in front of them, struggling to pay rent and wearing second-hand clothes, it makes them uncomfortable. They don't want to be reminded that heroes come home and still have to live in the real world, or that their families are left behind when they die." The truth of Sarah's words hit the gathered students like a physical blow. Many of them came from comfortable families who had never had to worry about basic necessities. They had grown up with the abstract concept of military service and sacrifice, but they had never been confronted with the concrete reality of what that sacrifice meant for the families left behind. Mr. Thompson, the school's history teacher, had heard the commotion in the hallway and come to investigate. When he saw the Medal of Honor in Madison's hands and the crowd of students surrounding Sarah, his expression immediately became serious. He approached slowly, clearly recognizing the significance of what he was seeing. "May I?" Mr. Thompson asked gently, extending his hand toward Madison. She quickly handed over the medal, obviously relieved to no longer be responsible for it. Mr. Thompson examined it carefully, his eyes widening as he read the inscription. "This is authentic," he said solemnly. "Sergeant James Martinez received this medal for extraordinary heroism during the Battle of Khe Sanh in Vietnam. I remember reading about his actions in a military history journal." He looked at Sarah with new understanding. "He was your father?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak for a moment. It had been years since anyone had spoken about her father with such knowledge and respect. Most people, when they learned about her parents' deaths, offered generic sympathy and quickly changed the subject. But Mr. Thompson understood the historical significance of what her father had done, and his words carried weight with the students who respected him. "What exactly did he do?" asked Jake, one of the football players who had been watching the drama unfold. His question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than mockery. Mr. Thompson looked at Sarah questioningly, clearly asking permission to share what he knew. Sarah nodded, realizing that the story was going to come out anyway, and she would rather have it told accurately by someone who understood its importance. Sergeant Martinez was part of a Marine outpost that came under heavy attack, Mr. Thompson began. When the position was overrun and his fellow Marines were trapped, he made multiple trips into enemy fire to carry wounded soldiers to safety. On his final trip, he stayed behind to hold off the enemy advance, allowing the evacuation helicopter to take off with the wounded. He was severely injured but survived, only to be told that 2 more Marines were still trapped in the bunker. The hallway was completely silent now. Even students who had been trying to get to class had stopped to listen to the story. Despite his injuries and direct orders to evacuate, Sergeant Martinez went back into the combat zone alone, Mr. Thompson continued. He managed to reach the trapped Marines and get them out, but the bunker collapsed just as they escaped. All 3 men survived, but Sergeant Martinez spent 8 months in military hospitals recovering from his injuries. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face now, but she didn't try to wipe them away. She had heard this story before, from her grandmother and from military officials who had visited after her father's death. But hearing it told in front of her classmates, seeing their faces as they realized what kind of man her father had been, was overwhelming. Madison, who had been silent since handing over the medal, finally found her voice. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I thought you were just..." She trailed off, clearly unable to finish the sentence. "You thought I was just poor," Sarah said, not unkindly. "You thought that because my clothes aren't expensive and I don't drive a nice car, I wasn't worth treating with respect. You thought that because I'm quiet and don't fight back, it was safe to humiliate me for entertainment." Madison's face crumpled, and, for the first time, Sarah saw her as something other than a cruel tormentor. She saw a 17-year-old girl who had just realized that her assumptions about the world and the people in it were terribly, terribly wrong. The bell for first period had rung several minutes ago, but nobody moved. Students, teachers, and even some administrative staff who had come to investigate the crowd were all transfixed by the scene playing out in the hallway. This was no longer just about teenage bullying or social hierarchies, this had become something much more significant. Principal Williams arrived in the hallway just as Mr. Thompson finished explaining the significance of Sergeant Martinez's Medal of Honor. The principal, a woman in her 50s who had been running Lincoln High School for over a decade, took in the scene with experienced eyes, the scattered contents of a backpack, the crowd of silent students, the tears on Sarah's face, and the precious medal in Mr. Thompson's careful hands. "Everyone needs to get to class immediately," Principal Williams announced firmly. "This is not a spectacle." Her voice carried the authority that came from years of managing teenagers, but even she seemed affected by the gravity of what was happening. The crowd reluctantly began to disperse, but Sarah could hear whispered conversations and see students pulling out their phones to text friends about what they had witnessed. By lunchtime, everyone in the school would know about the quiet girl with the Medal of Honor father, and Sarah wasn't sure how she felt about that prospect. Madison lingered behind as the other students left, clearly struggling with something she wanted to say. Her usual entourage of friends had abandoned her, perhaps sensing that this was not a moment for their typical group dynamics. For the first time since Sarah had known her, Madison looked genuinely vulnerable and uncertain. "Sarah, please," Madison said, approaching cautiously. "I need to talk to you. I need to explain, to apologize properly. What I did was unforgivable." Sarah was still gathering her scattered belongings from the hallway floor, trying to restore some order to her disrupted morning. The simple act of collecting her textbooks and pens felt surreal after everything that had just happened. Her hands were still shaking slightly, and she could feel the weight of stares from students who were reluctantly heading to their classes. "There's nothing to explain," Sarah replied without looking up. "You saw someone you thought was weak and vulnerable, and you decided to entertain yourself by humiliating them. The only thing that changed is that you found out I'm the daughter of a war hero. But that shouldn't matter. I deserved respect before you knew about my father, just like every other person in this school deserves respect regardless of their background." Principal Williams and Mr. Thompson exchanged glances, clearly impressed by Sarah's mature response to the situation. The principal knelt down to help Sarah collect the remaining items, a gesture that surprised several of the lingering students who weren't used to seeing their principal on her knees in a hallway. "Sarah, I'd like you to come to my office when you're ready," Principal Williams said gently. "We need to discuss what happened here, and I want to make sure you have the support you need. Mr. Thompson, perhaps you could join us as well." Madison took a step forward, her designer shoes clicking on the linoleum floor. "Please, Sarah. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want you to know that this isn't who I really am. I never meant for things to go this far." For the first time since the incident began, Sarah looked directly at Madison. What she saw there surprised her: genuine remorse, fear, and something that looked like self-hatred. Madison's carefully constructed image of superiority had completely crumbled, leaving behind a teenage girl who was clearly grappling with the realization that she had become someone she didn't like. "Isn't it, though?" Sarah asked quietly. "This is exactly who you've been for years, Madison. You've treated dozens of students like this. The only difference is that today you picked on someone whose story made you uncomfortable when you learned about it. What about all the other kids you've humiliated? Don't their stories matter too?" Madison's face went white, and she took a step backward as if Sarah had physically struck her. The truth of Sarah's words was undeniable. Over the years, Madison had established herself as the queen of Lincoln High School's social hierarchy, and she had maintained that position partly through the systematic intimidation and humiliation of students she considered beneath her. Mr. Thompson stepped forward, sensing that the conversation was reaching a critical moment. "Perhaps this would be better continued in a more private setting," he suggested. "Both of you have classes to get to, and this situation needs to be handled properly." Sarah stood up, her backpack finally repacked with all her scattered belongings. The medal was safely back in its usual place, hidden in a small inside pocket where she had carried it every day since starting high school. It was her father's presence with her, a reminder of his strength and sacrifice, and she felt violated that it had been exposed and handled by people who didn't understand its significance. "I don't need to talk to Madison," Sarah said to Principal Williams. "What's done is done. I just want to go to class and pretend this never happened." But, even as she said it, Sarah knew that pretending was no longer an option. The cat was out of the bag, and, by the end of the day, everyone in school would know about her father's Medal of Honor. The protective anonymity she had cultivated for years was gone forever. As they walked toward the principal's office, Sarah became aware of how students were looking at her differently. Where before she had been invisible, now she was the center of attention. Some students stared with curiosity, others with newfound respect, and a few with the kind of uncomfortable sympathy that made her skin crawl. In the principal's office, Sarah found herself sitting across from Principal Williams' desk while Mr. Thompson took a chair beside her. The office was decorated with photos of graduating classes and academic achievement awards, creating an atmosphere that was both official and oddly comforting. "Sarah, I want you to know that what happened today was completely unacceptable," Principal Williams began. "Madison and her friends will face serious consequences for their actions. Bullying of any kind is not tolerated at this school, and what they did to you was particularly egregious." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I don't want to be the reason other students get in trouble. I just want to be left alone." "That's very generous of you," Mr. Thompson said, "but there have to be consequences. What Madison did wasn't just wrong because of who your father was, it was wrong because it's not acceptable to treat any student that way." Principal Williams nodded in agreement. "We've been aware that there are social dynamics in this school that need to be addressed. What happened today has brought those issues into sharp focus, and we're going to use this as an opportunity to make some changes." Sarah felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. "What kind of changes?" "Well, for starters, I think it would be appropriate to honor your father's service in some way," Principal Williams said. "Perhaps a display in our trophy case, or a presentation during our Veterans Day assembly. Your father's sacrifice should be remembered and celebrated." "No," Sarah said quickly, more forcefully than she had intended. "Absolutely not. I don't want my father's service turned into some kind of school publicity stunt. That medal isn't for show, it's personal. It's private." The two adults looked surprised by the vehemence of Sarah's response. They had clearly expected her to be pleased by the suggestion of honoring her father's memory. "I understand your feelings," Mr. Thompson said carefully. "But don't you think other students could benefit from learning about your father's heroism? It could be educational, inspirational even." Sarah felt anger rising in her chest, an emotion she rarely allowed herself to express. "You want to use my father's death to teach other kids lessons? You want to parade his sacrifice around so that everyone can feel good about themselves for 5 minutes before they forget about it and go back to their normal lives?" Principal Williams held up her hands in a calming gesture. "Sarah, that's not what we meant at all. We just thought you thought it would be a nice story," Sarah interrupted. "You thought it would be heartwarming and patriotic and all those things that make people feel good about themselves. But you didn't think about what it would mean for me to have my father's memory turned into a school project." The room fell silent. Through the office window, Sarah could see students moving through the hallways to their second period classes, their lives continuing normally while hers had been turned upside down in the space of 30 minutes. "My father didn't sacrifice his life so that it could be used to make other people feel better about themselves," Sarah continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "He died because he was trying to teach young soldiers how to stay alive in combat zones. He died doing his job, trying to protect other people. That's not a story, that's a life that was cut short, and a family that was left behind to figure out how to survive without him." Both Principal Williams and Mr. Thompson looked chastened by Sarah's words. It was clear that they had never considered the complexity of what she was dealing with, or how their well-meaning suggestions might feel like a violation of something sacred. "What do you need from us, Sarah?" Principal Williams asked gently. "How can we support you without making this harder than it already is?" Sarah thought for a moment, considering what she really wanted. "I need people to stop staring at me like I'm some kind of curiosity. I need Madison and her friends to leave me alone. And I need everyone to understand that my father's service doesn't make me special or different from anyone else. It just makes me the daughter of a good man who died too young." It was a request that sounded simple but would prove to be much more complicated than any of them realized. The news about Sarah's father spread through Lincoln High School with the speed and intensity of wildfire. By lunchtime, every student in the building had heard some version of the story, and, by the end of the day, the tale had grown and morphed in the way that high school gossip always does. Some students claimed that Sarah's father had won multiple medals, others said he had died in combat rather than in a training accident, and a few even suggested that Sarah had been hiding her identity as some kind of military princess. Sarah found herself in the surreal position of being simultaneously famous and misunderstood. Students who had never spoken to her before approached her in the hallways with awkward condolences and clumsy attempts at conversation. Teachers who had previously seen her as just another quiet student now looked at her with a mixture of respect and pity that made her deeply uncomfortable. During lunch, Sarah sat alone at her usual table in the corner of the cafeteria, trying to eat her sandwich while dozens of eyes watched her every move. The attention was overwhelming and unwanted. She had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility, and now she felt like a zoo animal on display. Jake Morrison, the football player who had asked about her father's actions during Mr. Thompson's impromptu history lesson, approached her table with obvious nervousness. He was tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of student who usually moved through the school with easy confidence, but now he seemed uncertain and almost shy. "Hey, Sarah," he said, standing awkwardly beside her table. "Is it okay if I sit down? I wanted to talk to you about something." Sarah looked up at him suspiciously. In 3 years at Lincoln High School, Jake had never spoken to her directly. They had been in a few classes together, but they moved in completely different social circles. She couldn't imagine what he might want to discuss with her now. "I guess," she said reluctantly, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Jake sat down carefully, as if he were afraid the chair might break under his weight. "I wanted to apologize for this morning," he began. "I know I wasn't one of the kids who dumped out your backpack or anything, but I was standing there watching it happen, and I didn't try to stop it." "That was wrong." Sarah studied his face, trying to determine if his apology was genuine or if this was some kind of elaborate setup. She had learned to be wary of sudden kindness from popular students. It often came with hidden motives or cruel punchlines. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked directly. Jake looked down at his hands, clearly struggling with how to express what he was feeling. "My older brother is in the Marines," he said finally. "He's deployed right now, somewhere I'm not supposed to know about. Every day, my parents worry that someone in uniform is going to show up at our door with bad news. When I heard about your father this morning, when I realized what he did and what happened to him, it made me think about my brother and about all the families who have to live with that fear." Sarah felt her defensive walls lowering slightly. This wasn't the reaction she had expected from Jake, and his mention of his own family's military connection made her see him in a different light. "I've been thinking about it all day," Jake continued. "About how you've been carrying this around by yourself, and how we've all been so caught up in our own stupid high school drama that we never bothered to really see each other as actual people with real lives and real problems." Before Sarah could respond, another student approached their table. It was Emma Rodriguez, a girl from Sarah's chemistry class who had always been friendly but never particularly close. Emma was holding a lunch tray and looking nervous but determined. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Emma said, "but I heard what happened this morning, and I wanted you to know that my grandfather was in Vietnam too. He never talks about it much, but I know it was really hard for him. I just thought maybe you'd want to know that someone understands, at least a little bit." Soon, other students began to approach. Maria Santos, whose uncle had died in Afghanistan. David Chen, whose father had served in the Navy. Rebecca Johnson, whose family had immigrated from Bosnia after surviving a war there. One by one, students began sharing their own connections to military service, conflict, and loss. Sarah found herself at the center of an impromptu gathering that had nothing to do with high school social status and everything to do with shared human experience. These were students from different cliques, different backgrounds, different economic levels, all brought together by the recognition that real life was bigger and more complex than the artificial hierarchy of high school. As the lunch period continued, Sarah began to realize that her assumption about her classmates might have been incomplete. She had believed that none of them would understand her father's sacrifice or her family's struggles, but it turned out that many of them carried their own hidden stories of loss, service, and resilience. Not everyone's reaction was positive, however. From across the cafeteria, Sarah could see Madison sitting with her remaining friends, looking isolated and uncomfortable. Several students were giving Madison cold stares and whispering among themselves, clearly discussing the morning's incident. The social dynamics that had once worked in Madison's favor were now turning against her. After lunch, Sarah found herself walking to her afternoon classes with a small group of students who had joined her at the lunch table. The conversation was easy and natural, focusing on normal teenage topics rather than the dramatic events of the morning. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she might actually belong somewhere at Lincoln High School. But the day wasn't over, and the full consequences of the morning's revelation were still unfolding. During her final class of the day, Sarah was called to the principal's office over the intercom. She gathered her books and made her way through the hallways, noticing that some students stopped their conversations to watch her pass. The attention was still uncomfortable, but it felt different now, less like being examined and more like being acknowledged. In Principal Williams' office, Sarah found an unexpected gathering. Her grandmother Maria was there, having left work early after receiving a call from the school. Also present were Mr. Thompson, Principal Williams, and, surprisingly, a man in military dress uniform who was introduced as Colonel Martinez, no relation, despite the shared surname. "Sarah, please sit down," Principal Williams said gently. "Colonel Martinez is here from the Regional Veterans Affairs Office. He heard about what happened today and wanted to speak with you." Sarah felt a familiar anxiety rising in her chest. She had dealt with military officials before, usually around Memorial Day or Veterans Day, when various organizations reached out to families of Medal of Honor recipients. These interactions were always well-meaning but often felt forced and artificial. Colonel Martinez was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that immediately put Sarah somewhat at ease. "Miss Martinez," he said, "I want to start by saying that I'm not here in any official capacity. I'm here as someone who served with men like your father, and who understands the complexity of what you're dealing with." Sarah's grandmother reached over and squeezed her hand. Maria had been crying, Sarah could tell by the slight redness around her eyes, but she was trying to stay strong for her granddaughter's sake. "I don't want any publicity," Sarah said immediately. "I don't want interviews or ceremonies or anything like that. I just want to go back to normal." Colonel Martinez nodded understanding. "That's completely your choice, and I respect it. But I want you to know that what happened today, difficult as it was, might actually be an opportunity for some positive change. Not for publicity or recognition, but for real understanding and education." He explained that he had been contacted by several parents whose children had called home to tell them about the events at school. Many of these parents were veterans themselves, or family members of people who had served, and they were interested in creating better support systems for military families in the community. "The truth is," Colonel Martinez said, "military families often struggle in silence. You and your grandmother have been carrying a heavy burden alone, and today showed that there are people in your community who want to help carry that burden with you." Sarah looked at her grandmother, who had been silent throughout the conversation. Maria's eyes were filled with pride and pain in equal measure. Sarah realized that her grandmother had been protecting her from much of the outside attention and support that had been offered over the years, trying to give her a normal childhood despite their unusual circumstances. "What kind of support?" Sarah asked cautiously. Mr. Thompson leaned forward. "Several parents have already contacted the school about starting a support group for military families. There's also been discussion about creating scholarships for children of veterans, and about bringing in guest speakers who can help students understand the reality of military service and sacrifice." "It wouldn't be about you specifically," Principal Williams added quickly. "It would be about creating a better environment for all students who have military connections, and for educating everyone about the complexities of service and sacrifice." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the possibility that the worst day of her high school career might actually lead to something meaningful. The idea that other students might not have to hide their own military family connections the way she had was appealing, even if the attention was still uncomfortable. "Can I think about it?" Sarah asked. "Of course," Colonel Martinez said. "Take all the time you need. But, Sarah, I want you to know that your father would be proud of how you've handled yourself today. You've shown the same kind of courage and integrity that earned him that Medal of Honor." As the meeting concluded and Sarah prepared to leave school with her grandmother, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the space of a single day. The secret she had guarded so carefully was now public knowledge, but, instead of the judgment and pity she had feared, she had found understanding and respect from unexpected sources. The transformation wasn't complete, and there would certainly be more challenges ahead, but, for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she didn't have to face those challenges alone. 3 weeks had passed since the incident in the hallway, and Lincoln High School felt like a completely different place to Sarah Martinez. The changes had been subtle at first, but they had grown and spread throughout the school community in ways that no one could have predicted. The morning Sarah dreaded most came on a Tuesday, when she walked into her first period chemistry class to find Madison Clark waiting by her usual desk. Madison looked different, less polished, more uncertain, and obviously nervous about whatever conversation she was preparing to have. "Sarah, could I talk to you for a minute before class starts?" Madison asked quietly. Her voice lacked the commanding tone that had once intimidated students throughout the school. Instead, she sounded almost fragile, like someone who was still learning how to navigate the world without the armor of cruelty and superiority. Sarah had been avoiding Madison for weeks, taking different routes through the school and timing her movements to minimize the chances of an encounter. The truth was, she wasn't sure how she felt about Madison's attempts to apologize and make amends. Forgiveness felt complicated when the hurt had been so public and so deliberate. "I suppose," Sarah replied, setting her backpack down carefully. She had developed a heightened awareness of her belongings since the incident, always making sure her father's medal was secure in its hidden pocket. Madison took a deep breath before speaking. "I want you to know that I've been doing a lot of thinking since that day. About who I was, about how I treated people, about why I thought it was okay to hurt others for entertainment." She paused, clearly struggling with the words. "I've been seeing a counselor, trying to understand why I became someone so awful." Sarah studied Madison's face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. What she saw instead was genuine remorse and what appeared to be the beginning of real self-awareness. Madison's transformation seemed authentic, but Sarah had learned to be cautious about trusting people's motivations. "I'm not telling you this because I expect forgiveness," Madison continued. "I know that what I did was unforgivable. I'm telling you because I want you to know that your father's story, your story, changed something fundamental in me. It made me realize that I had become the kind of person who causes real harm to real people." Before Sarah could respond, other students began filing into the classroom. Among them was Jake Morrison, who had become something of an unofficial guardian for Sarah over the past few weeks. He noticed the tense conversation and approached with obvious concern. "Everything okay here?" Jake asked, positioning himself slightly between Madison and Sarah in a gesture that was protective but not aggressive. "It's fine," Sarah said, surprised to realize that she meant it. Madison was just apologizing. Jake nodded but remained close by as Madison gathered her courage to continue. "Sarah, I've been working with the counselor and with Principal Williams on something. We're starting an anti-bullying program at the school, and I want to be part of it. I want to tell my story about how I became a bully and what it took for me to realize how wrong I was." The idea of Madison sharing her own story of transformation was intriguing but also concerning to Sarah. She worried that it might become another way to exploit her father's sacrifice for someone else's redemption narrative. "This isn't about me or my father," Madison said quickly, seeming to read Sarah's concerns. "This is about me taking responsibility for my actions and trying to prevent other students from making the same mistakes I made. Your father's story will always belong to you and your family. This is about my story and what I learned from facing the consequences of my choices. Over the following weeks, Sarah watched as Madison followed through on her commitment to change. The anti-bullying program that she helped develop focused on the real psychological and emotional damage that bullying causes, and Madison's willingness to examine her own behavior publicly created a powerful example for other students. Meanwhile, the military family support group that had been proposed in Principal Williams' office had become a reality. What started as a small gathering of students with military connections had grown into a larger community that included parents, veterans, and community members. Sarah had initially been reluctant to participate, but she found that sharing experiences with other military families was healing in ways she hadn't expected. The group wasn't about glorifying military service or turning anyone into symbols. Instead, it provided a space for honest conversations about the unique challenges that military families face: the frequent moves, the deployments, the constant worry, and the difficulty of fitting into civilian communities that sometimes struggle to understand their experiences. Emma Rodriguez became one of Sarah's closest friends through the support group. Emma's grandfather, it turned out, had struggled with what would now be recognized as PTSD after returning from Vietnam, and her family had dealt with many of the same isolation and financial challenges that Sarah and her grandmother had faced. Having someone who truly understood made an enormous difference in Sarah's daily life. The academic year was drawing to a close, and Sarah found herself facing a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Several colleges had reached out to her after learning about her academic achievements and her family's military background. Some offered full scholarships, others provided special programs for children of veterans, and a few had even mentioned the possibility of ROTC programs that could help her follow in her father's footsteps. Sarah sat in her grandmother's small kitchen one evening, looking at the acceptance letters spread across the table. Maria was working her evening shift at the diner, so Sarah was alone with her thoughts and the weight of choosing her future. The Medal of Honor sat in its small display case on the kitchen counter. Maria had finally convinced Sarah to display it properly rather than keeping it hidden in her backpack. The medal caught the light from the overhead fixture, its bronze surface reflecting the years of honor and sacrifice it represented. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she had real choices about her future. The financial barriers that had seemed insurmountable were no longer impossible to overcome, and she had a support system that would help her succeed wherever she decided to go. But, more importantly, she had learned something valuable about herself and about other people. The shame and isolation she had felt about her father's death and her family's struggles had been largely self-imposed. While there were certainly people in the world who wouldn't understand or respect her father's sacrifice, there were many more who did understand, who cared, and who wanted to help. The phone rang, interrupting her contemplation. It was Emma, calling to discuss their plans for the summer and to share some exciting news about her own college acceptance. As they talked, Sarah realized that she was looking forward to the future in a way that she hadn't in years. When Maria came home from work that night, she found Sarah still sitting at the kitchen table, but the acceptance letters had been organized into neat piles: definite no's, maybes, and serious possibilities. "How was your day, Mija?" Maria asked, hanging up her diner uniform and sitting down across from her granddaughter. "Good," Sarah replied, and meant it. "Really good. I think I'm ready to make some decisions about college." Maria smiled, the kind of smile that carried years of worry and hope in equal measure. "Your father would be so proud of the young woman you've become," she said. "Not because of what he did, but because of who you are." Sarah looked at the Medal of Honor sitting in its place of honor on the counter, then back at her grandmother's tired but happy face. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like she truly understood what his sacrifice had been for, not for glory or recognition, but for the chance for people like her to have choices, to have futures, to have the freedom to become whoever they were meant to be. The girl who had once hidden her father's medal in shame now carried his memory with pride, not as a burden or a secret, but as a source of strength and inspiration. The transformation that had begun with cruelty and humiliation had led to understanding, community, and hope. As Sarah began to seriously consider which college would help her achieve her goals that now included helping other military families and working to create more understanding and support for veterans' children, she realized that sometimes the worst moments in life can become the foundation for the best ones. The medal that shouldn't exist in a high school backpack had revealed not just Sarah's hidden story, but the hidden stories of countless others. In doing so, it had transformed not only her life but the entire community around her, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with a single moment of painful truth. Sarah Martinez was no longer invisible, no longer ashamed, and no longer alone. She was ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring, carrying her father's legacy not as a secret burden but as a proud banner of service, sacrifice, and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit.